This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Great pleasure to welcome Sheila Cohen back. I know you've spoken before, though I can't remember what it was about, unfortunately.
My last book, I think.
we won't ask you to see whether you can recall. But on this occasion, as we perhaps just were in there, she's going to talk about her new book about trade unionism at Fords Dagenham, which has already received some very interesting and good reviews, and Sheila will speak around the area of the book, and there'll be time for discussion and questions. So, Sheila.
Okay. Roughly how long?
50 minutes.
Oh, yes, you did say. I've completely forgotten. I doubt somehow if I'll be able to speak that long. Anyway, so we've already had two very interesting references. The brother here about Big Flame in Liverpool, which reminds me of Hugh Barner's book, and a very interesting discussion in that. And of course, we also have here a long-term activist, staunch trade unionist from Fords Dagenham, Rod Finlayson, who I'm very pleased to see here tonight. I'm sure he'll be able to tell you a lot more than I can, really. Keith said that these discussions about trade unions and socialism, which are about socialism, and of course I hadn't really sort of come with that necessarily that sort of thing in my head, trade unions and socialism, but of course that is, since it's my own main interest, then I think I can probably quite easily shift what I'm about to say into, something that borders on socialism, because basically I've always been of the belief, as long as I've been active, that really, it's a very old-fashioned thing to say, of course, but the roots of socialism do still lie in the working class, which you wouldn't know if you've listened to very many socialists around the movement. And in fact, if you look at an example like Fords Dagenham, you see some of the roots of, the potential for socialism within the working class. And of course, the contradiction there, which I got into trouble for mentioning when I spoke in Liverpool once, is that that most working class people are not educated middle class socialists who've read a lot of Marx and read a lot of Gramsci and all the rest of it. And I'm not surprised I got into trouble for saying that, but it's because it sounds very snobbish. But that is one of the contradictions, that's one of the issues that comes up, that the working class potentially has a power, of course, has enormous power, and yet large portions of the time working class people aren't really thinking, huge generalisation. Well, let's put it the other way around. But it's really only with action, which is rooted in working class experience, workplace experience, labour process experience, if you like, that tends to sort of throw working class people into action, and thereby, if you like, at the same time, in a very sort of dialectical way, into thinking a lot more about society around them and so on. So that's one aspect of the process, the type of process that links trade unions and socialism. And that's really that relates to another distinction I want to make, which is very important when we look at the history of the labour movement. It's not really a distinction, it's more of a sort of dialectical interrelationship between spontaneity and activism. So when I'm talking about spontaneity on the one side, and as I say, it's not they aren't two separate things, they are interrelated. What I'm talking about is some of the examples that I can give from this history of Fords Dagenham, which I'll come back to in a moment. For example, about how it got unionised in the first place, and how various other sorts of changes were made, which management had once said they would never, countenance. So you've got spontaneity on the one hand in terms of explosions of conflict, which I think are an extremely important part of the whole labour movement, and of course when you look further back in history, explosions of working class action based in the workplace, which created formations like Soviets and workers' councils. Soviets are workers' councils, or were. So we're talking about, as far as I'm concerned, we're talking about socialism in the context of trade unionism. I'm certainly not talking about Len McCluskey trying to get resolutions through about who knows what at Labour Party conference. I'm talking about a much more grassroots and workplace-based sort of phenomenon, for want of a better word. So I'll just go back to the way I was going to structure the talk. I didn't really sort of think so much of it in terms of trade unions and socialism, but as I say, I think it is very much related. And so I think the book book as it stands, and I'll talk a little bit about how I came to write that book, it represents two major and very linked aspects of trade union struggle and trade union development. One is what you might call spontaneity, in other words, in terms of sudden explosions of action. And certainly, for example, trade unionism in the car industry, or at least the first hold of the Transport and General Workers Union in the car industry occurred in the context of a spontaneous explosion of action at Press Steel in Oxford in 1934, in which a workforce which had never expressed any particular interest in trade unionism before, which was largely women, walked out, some last straw thing, actually, I think about very dangerous conditions in the workplace and great heat and dust and so forth. And that was actually the first plants connected with the car industry that was organised by the T&G, although of course the T&G didn't organise it, the workers did. But the T&G, TGW as it then was the union that they wanted to join. And so that was the beginning of, they Press Steel workers at a series of meetings around the country, which Ford workers attended. And again, that was an example of a very sort of, unexpected, unpredicted explosion of action. So you've got spontaneity as one part of this dialectic, and you have the role of activists on the other. So of course activists are the absolute cream of the working class movement. They are the gold. I tell this to shop stewards when I go to teach shop steward classes. You've got people who are, when I say activists, I mean people who are still, shop stewards, reps who are still in the workplace. You've got people who are in the workplace every day who are experiencing what their members are experiencing, unless they're kind of, going off the floor, which is something we'll come back to. At the same time, of course, they're usually quite committed people, quite dedicated people, and they are much more likely, they will probably associate with other activists and get a broader view of the trade union movement. So, for example, in Fords, of course, the activists made many attempts to form a combined committee, both in the motor industry and in the various Fords plants, where, of course, they would associate with other activists, and that would presumably generate a lot of discussion by these people who do dedicate their life to the trade, well, not their life, but certainly are very dedicated in their work, within the trade union movement. I'm sure Rob will have something to say about that in the discussion. So you have this kind of dialectic between spontaneity and activism, and to take that back to Fords Dagenham, as we all know, Henry Ford did not like trade unions very much. In fact, he made a lovely remark about them being something like a Jewish conspiracy. I don't actually have the quote in front of me, but it's in the book. So he was both anti-Semitic and anti-trade union, and I'm sure, as somebody who happens to be Jewish, so not very religious, not at all religious, I suppose, there might be some sort of link between those things, but I sort of doubt it. Anyway, you had a very, very anti-union company in its first inception in Detroit, where, Henry Ford started building factories in the very early 20th century, and finally ended up, although he kept the others, but finally ended up with the biggest one, the River Rouge, the Rouge plant, which is still in existence at the moment. And of course, American activists were trying to get these factories organised for a very long time. You then had the movement of the 1930s, which to some extent was encouraged by Roosevelt and the introduction of the National Labour Relations Act. But it went a lot further than that, and I don't really have time to go into all the details of that. But it was in that wave of struggle that Ford's finally became organised in Detroit. It was the last company to be organised in Detroit, because Ford's was so implacably anti-union, and a lot of other parts plants and so on had already become trade union plants. Ford's was the last, and again it was a sort of an upsurge. They didn't stage an occupation as they did in Dagenham, but the workers all came out and circled the plants, and it's quite a dramatic story, all of which of course is in Notoriously Militant. And then when we come to Dagenham, naturally, in fact, Fords first built a car plant in Trafford Park near Manchester, where there were mainly engineering workers who were much too stroppy for Ford and his acolyte with a peculiar name, Lord, I can't remember his name, but somebody with a strange name who came and did stuff for him in Britain. They just jacked up their wages and managed to tame that little bit of trade unionism. But at the same time, the Trafford Park plant definitely did breed, a sort of good residue, or not a residue, but a layer of activists who then were moved down, when all the Manchester workers were moved down to Fords Dagenham, some of them with no notice whatsoever, told in the morning, or pack your bags, getting on the train. So you had a sort of a layer of, not just sort of, experienced Ford workers, but also many activists, particularly from the engineering union, moving down to Dagenham. And it's that core of activists that you can sort of follow through the 30s who are sort of leading strikes and, just working, all out to try to organise Fords. And another thing you have to remember about particular thing you have to remember about the Dagenham site is that it wasn't initially an integrated site. The Dagenham plant was built in 1931, and on the same site they had parts plants. They had Kelsey Hayes wheel plant. I've never been able to find out much about that. But they also had Briggs Bodies, which was very significant, and the river plant, which was also owned by Briggs. You might have heard about the river plant in the context of the sewing machinist dispute in 1968, which I will say here and now was not about equal pay. Let's bust that myth. It was not about equal pay. I'll come back on that if anybody wants me to. Okie doke. So you had these plants that weren't actually part of, they supplied Fords, and they were the same site as Dagenham, but they weren't yet part of Fords. And in particular, it was the Briggs Bodies plant, which had, one historian put it, had a sort of really extraordinarily unusual degree of direct trade union democracy within that plant. And the details are in the book about that. But one of the issues, which was quite effective, quite influential in both Briggs and Fords, was that because trade union recognition was so slow, obviously Briggs being the parts supplier to Fords just did everything that Fords did, basically. So they didn't recognise the T&G. They only really gave any kind of union recognition to very skilled workers, because I suppose they didn't want to have any trouble with them. But they wouldn't recognise the T&G. In fact, in 1937 there was a very sad letter sent by a certain number of Briggs workers to the TUC pleading for intervention because the conditions they were experiencing were so terrible. People were being killed, rushing backwards and forwards in the plant. There was absolutely no regulation of working conditions at all. And the TUC, made a few little noises and, protested to Fords. And in fact, the union leaders began to carry out negotiations with Ford management, but you still, finally, as a result of, all this kind of kerfuffle, and also the fact that during the Second World War, the government was quite favourable to unionisation because, interestingly, they felt that union organisation would mean there'd be fewer disputes. So there was a sort of pro-union atmosphere in during the war, helped along by the Communist Party, which didn't want any strikes because they were fighting, fascism and so forth. So there was a much more, slightly mellower atmosphere. And at that time, I think it was in 1944, Ford management finally agreed to recognise unions in terms of, the official trade unions. And because they'd, delayed it for so long, there were something like 23 trade unions who actually had seats on the committee that was formed, the Ford National Joint Negotiating Committee, FNJNC, probably still exists in some form or other. But what they would not recognise was workplace representatives. So this is where we begin to come to the actual history of the branch. And so what happened was you'd already had a bit of a kerfuffle in 1944, as I say, with two very militant shop stewards occupying a manager's office, which led to, Ford say, all right, we'll recognise the trade unions. But it wasn't until 1946 that you actually got real shop floor organisation, or that Fords would agree to recognising shop floor organisation. And that's again to reflect the certain, the various sort of points of view that I'm trying to put forward here. That arose out of a completely unpredicted, unofficial dispute by machine grinders, I think, who might have been slightly more skilled workers. But anyway, they just walked out on unofficial strike, partly over partly over merit pay. Ford used to pay merit pay, and most people hated merit pay because you had to crawl to the foreman, and some people would get more and others would get less. So clearly it wasn't a good thing, and so they were walked out over merit pay, but also over lack of shop floor representation. So I don't know what the exact trigger was, but they were out on an official strike. And the rest of the Ford workforce just kind of rallied around, and they all stopped work as well, and they occupied the Dagenham plant. So there you go. It's another example of this, amazing sort of spontaneous explosion of action and solidarity, which just comes from the roots, and you might even argue comes out of the, collective experience of work, particularly in a stinking horrible place like that, where the work itself is pretty grim. And so you had this explosion of, of action and solidarity in March 1946, an occupation which lasted for, I can't remember, about a week, and all kinds of people trying to pacify the workers and get them back to work. But they wouldn't go back to work until Ford agreed to their demands to have shop stewards. They wanted 92 shop stewards, and Ford's agreed to 75, I think, typical of Fords, they can never actually give everything. There are a lot of women involved in this as well, by the way. And the Daily Work had some report saying, the women took their knitting into the occupation, so there you go. So that was a feature of the wartime period, and for quite a long time afterwards there were a lot of very, very active women workers and women stewards, in Briggs certainly. Some good references to that, I hope, in the book. So you had this explosion of, action, and and they won their demand as a result. And it was in the sort of aftermath of that, probably, the next month, in fact, in April, that the branch that I wrote the history of was formed in April 1946. I really should have started by saying how I came to write this history. I was going to do that, but I forgot. But so 1107, TNG Region 1, 1107 as it then was founded in April 1946. And unfortunately, we also have to record its death during this discussion, which took place in September 2012. So I'll come on to that when I have time. Okay, so what happened to Fords after they began to, have shop floor representation? Well, the 50s were, continued to be quite a stormy period. You had a number of episodes. Again, we're kind of shuttling backwards and forwards between Fords itself and Briggs, because Briggs still wasn't integrated into Fords. And one of the very, notorious episodes of the time, 1957, was the sacking of a shop steward called Johnny McLaughlin, who was known as the bell ringer, because he used to ring a bell to summon his members. And he was an AEU steward in Briggs Bodies. This happened just after the Suez crisis, or in the wake of the Suez crisis, when Fords just got rid of a lot of people. They just sort of lined people up and said, okay, people on the right are sacked, because of the decline in demand due to the petrol problem. So the reason for a researcher why Johnny McLaughlin's sacking is of significance, obviously it's very significant anyway, but what happened was, the AEU members were going to come out on strike, fair enough, spontaneous strike is the usual sort of thing, to defend their steward. But noises were made in the Houses of Parliament, and the Labour MP for Dagenham suggested that instead of, a strike, there should be an inquiry into the sacking of Johnny McLaughlin. So naturally, after the inquiry, Johnny McLaughlin remained sacked, not a big surprise. But the fact is that the inquiry under Lord Cameron actually reveals an awful lot of very interesting things about what was going on in Briggs bodies at the time. So that's a remarkable source of information about what was going on in Briggs bodies in particular. And one of the statements that Cameron used when he was talking about Briggs bodies, and which was then later on reiterated by Jack Scamp, I think it was, I can't remember, somebody, or Lord Jack or somebody who did another inquiry in 1963. They both used the same phrase. They said that at Fords and at Briggs there was a union within the union. So the first union has a small u and the second union has a big U. In other words, there was, the sort of workplace unionism that I'm talking about within the official ranks of the trade unions. And of course the official trade unions didn't really like the sort of thing that was going on on the shop floor. But I think that's a very interesting notion of the union within the union, and it represents, again, my own sort of preoccupations, if you like, about workplace trade union democracy, because of course you could very well say, and most of the activists did say, that the union with a big U wasn't really representing, them and the people that they represented. It wasn't sort of taking up their issues, it wasn't defending them. The unions on the FNGANC were very disapproving about shop floor action. There was various notices issued about how shop stewards should really keep their members under control and so forth. So there was very much that distinction between formal unionism and the much more volatile and labour process related and exploitation related trade unionism on the shop floor. And then, of course, shortly after Johnny McLaughlin had been sacked and the Cameron report had, Lord Cameron had gone back to his other business, whatever that was, there was a very significant event at Fords Dagenham, and that was the building of the paint, trim and assembly plant in 1959. And just to sort of fast forward to the future, it was really in the PTA, as it was known, that the more militant, for want of a better word, activists were gathered. And I think, again, that's not really an accident, partly because of the assembly plant was just a dreadful place to work, really, really dreadful place to work. One of the branch members who I interviewed, Alf Richards, who actually worked in the engine plant but spent a short time on the assembly line in that plant, said it was like being sent to prison. He never wanted to have it repeated. And again, I'm sure Rod can give us more information about that. I should have mentioned, sorry, I haven't really constructed much of an image of the plant, that as well as the Briggs plants, which were close to the river, there was also the engine plant. That was the first production plant that Fords built, sometimes called the chassis plant. So that one was built in 1931, and it wasn't until 1959 that they specifically built the assembly plant. And of course, when they built this plant, and that was after Briggs and Fords had been brought together, by the way, they'd been standardised, their conditions had been standardised in 1958, so it was already one big Ford plant. Briggs Bodies workers came over to work at the PTA, and I can't quite remember what the other aspect of it was I was going to say. I mean, obviously Fords wanted to start the PTA off with a nice quiescent workforce, but since that half of the people who started work there were from Briggs Bodies and very used to effective workplace action, that notion didn't last very long. And also the convener of the PTA was a guy called Kevin Halpin, of whom you might have heard. He's also recently produced a book about Fords called something like Memoirs of, or at least a memoir called Memoirs of Militant, which of course covers his time in Fords. And I hope I'm not offending anybody here if I say that I would think of the CP, certainly at that time, as being a rather conciliatory force in industrial relations at Fords. But Kevin Halpin was the opposite of that. Or not the opposite, but he certainly wasn't like that. And he supported two things which were extremely important at Fords, that he, if you like, thought thought they were good. One was multi-unionism. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. I have mentioned that, yes, because of the late organisation of Fords. It meant that there were many unions. It wasn't just the property of one trade union, the organising there. And the CP, whose strength was in the AEU, wanted, Fords and in fact Briggs bodies to be all AEU. And Kevin Halpin stood out against that. He said the multi-unionism was a good idea, a good thing, and it was a good thing because it led to more trade union democracy in the workplace, because you didn't have people who were just advocating the policy of their own union. Shop stewards were just shop stewards. They were representing the members in their constituency. They weren't sort of trying to shove sort of AEU stuff down people's throats or T&G policy down people's throats. And this, I'll just digress for a moment to mention something that somebody I admire a lot, if you like, who I quoted from in the book, who was a guy who edited a sort of syndicalist magazine called Solidarity. Of course, Ken, thank you very much, Ken Weller. I've been to see him quite a few times, and he made the point once when I went to see him that one of the undemocratic things about any kind of political organisation, say it's the CP or the SWP or IS or anything else, kind of having a force or influence in a workplace, is that they will try to get resolutions through which are about their sort of line. So he thought, that was a good thing, really, that he thought that Kevin Halpin was, well, I don't know if he thought that, but Kevin Halpin wasn't really like that. He wasn't trying to push the CP line, or not as much as possibly some people might have been. And of course the same thing could be said of many other organisations. I'm not sort of just attacking the CP here on that basis. But okay, so we had the establishment of the PTA in 1959, and as I've said, it wasn't the docile workforce that management had hoped for, because you've got these Briggs Bodies people coming in, and of course the nature of the work was such as to breed militancy. And there was a guy I interviewed called, I think, Eddie Heslop, who made the point that strikes and problems began almost as soon as the plant was established. So of course management wasn't very happy with that, because the assembly plant was obviously absolutely key, and they therefore they put their heads together. I mean, this was a very early time for management to really be thinking about running industrial relations in any kind of calculated way. They didn't really do that. They just went in with big stick, particularly at Fords. But this, I think, the very early 60s was probably the beginning of management thinking, we've got to have a little bit more of a relationship with the shop floor representatives. And in fact, the convener of the river plant, Bernie Passingham, said something like that to me. He said, we got to thinking, it's a stupid way to be going on, we should have, management should have better relationships. We don't want people walking out all the time, because that leads to layoffs. So that was his justification. People walk out, everyone else is laid off and loses pay. Whereas I think probably he was just being slightly seduced by the fact that he was a convener and they were being offered giving offices and secretarial help. This was at a very early time in the 60s, before that became common. But the PTA didn't start out like that. It started out as just your, sort of militant factory, and the management, as I say, was beginning to be more and more aware of the fact that they really needed to do something about this, and so they actually did, as far as one can tell from what I've read, in particular a very good book by Graham Turner called The Car Makers, which just goes over 3 years roughly in the early 60s, so it's very detailed and very, very useful. And he talks about what they called the October Revolution in 1962, which did happen in October, where they decided they weren't going to have any more of this in the PTA, and they made the excuse that there was a CP steward called Bill Francis, who always made a point of having meetings across all 3 lines in his shop, because if one line could continue, they wouldn't have so much clout. So he did this, and then he had a meeting in works time across all 3 lines, so they stopped, and management took that as an excuse for dismissing him. So of course when he was dismissed, there had to be a big strike, because you can't dismiss a steward without a protest. So PTA walked out, but the problem was they couldn't get the other plants to come out with them. I can't quite remember what their reasons were, but they weren't I think people didn't really quite see, I can't remember now, it's all in the book, but they couldn't get the other plants to come out with them. And this, of course, was exactly, I think the engine plant stopped for like, a few hours, but they couldn't really get a walkout. And that was the beginning of the end, for a short time, of militant organisation in the PTA, because about 4,000 workers had walked out, and management, the negotiations took forever, for months. Management gradually let the workers back in if they sort of said they were going to be good boys. They were all men, I think, by then. And they did awful things like sending them to shops they didn't know and increasing the speed up and, really sort of hammering the workers. And in the end, there were only 17 people left out, and one of them was Kevin Halpin, so he got the sack then. So you can read all about that in his memoirs. And then, of course, that led to a bit of a dip in shop floor militancy in the PTA. And the AEU, which at the time was more militant and radical than the TNG, gave way in terms of shop floor leadership to these TNG stewards who were known as the mods, which I always think is quite funny because, of course, in 1963 they really were mods. Never mind. And so they had this sort of moderate leadership for a little while. And in fact, if you look in detail at the period of the sort of, early to late-ish 60s, there wasn't a whole lot going on in terms of shop floor action, but there was, of course, it was an increasingly militant period. And then, 1968, for goodness sake, of course, that was the year of the sewing machinist strike. That came over after, in the wake of a huge regrading exercise that Ford introduced, because there'd been so many disputes about which grade people were in and for merit money and all the rest of it. So they were going to get rid of merit money and bring in a more, logical, supposedly, grading structure. And it's interesting because they made one of their first attempts to actually, draw shop stewards into, sort of collaboration by asking them to be on the grading committees, but they actually left the grading committees because they just felt they were being ignored. It's all in the book. I can't remember the exact issue there. And of course, what happened with the sewing machinists was they were skilled workers, and they wanted to go from a grade B, which was semi-skilled, to a grade C, which was skilled. And they had actually been allocated to grade C by an initial committee, but that was not, honoured by management. And they were just left in limbo for months and months and months, not knowing which grade they were going to be on. And of course, the reason management, I don't think management was even thinking about it when they did put in their grievance. Obviously, the reason why management didn't want to promote them or up them from semi-skilled to skilled-ish status, C grade, was that then thousands of Ford workers would put their claim in as well to be upgraded to that. So what happened was they walked out. There was a magnificent strike. It was absolutely solid. It brought Fords to a complete standstill. The Halewood women workers came out as well. It was, an amazing occasion. As I say, the film is a complete distortion because it says that they were striking for equal pay, which they were not. They were striking to have a C grade, which would have meant they got more money, but they really wanted their skill to be recognised. That was what they all said. And Barbara Castle steps in, not in a benevolent fashion as shown in the film at all, but in a very sneaky, underhand fashion. And she sat down with them, cups of tea and all the rest of it. And she finally persuaded them to go back to work. With the promise. They got a rise anyway. She gave them a rise of, I can't remember what it was, but a little more than they were getting. And she also promised a court of inquiry under Lord, I can't remember who it was. And they thought the court of inquiry would give them their upgrading. They were just convinced of the logic and the justice of their case. Well, naturally, because it was logical and just. And of course, the inquiry did not give them the upgrading. So they were very disillusioned and pissed off about that. But in the meantime, another dispute was blowing up. In fact, in 1969, there were 3 issues, all beginning with P. One was productivity, Ford's trying to increase productivity. Another one was penalty clauses, genius idea they brought in to try and stop people from walking out and so on. And the other issue was parity, because Ford workers, they weren't on piecework. They'd never been on piecework. Ford didn't like piecework for some reason or other, I can't remember. And so, their earnings were falling way behind those of, say, Chrysler or Roots or, the big car companies in the Midlands, they were all getting a lot more than Ford workers. So they had a strike in 1969 over all those issues, which, from what I remember, was not all that successful. And the stewards wanted to come out again in 1970. Workers were very disillusioned and wouldn't do it. And then in 1971, they did. They went on a 9-week strike for parity. And guess who sold them out? One of the terrible twins, yes.
Jones and Scanlon.
Absolutely, thank you very much, yes. They did a deal behind everybody's back, behind the stewards' backs. The stewards actually met Jack Jones in Euston Station and said, oh, where are you going? Oh, I'm just passing through. He didn't tell them he was going to a meeting with whoever the employment minister was at the time. And also this American, the head of the AFL-CIO who was over at the time, was very keen on 3-year deals, tried to persuade Fords to bring in a 3-year deal, and they got a 2-year deal in the end. So Jones and Scanlon definitely went behind the workers' back on that one. And they also agreed, Jones and Scanlon did, to put out the results, or to test the vote, with a secret ballot. They never had a secret ballot before. It had always been show of hands meetings. And people were completely bewildered by the secret ballot. They'd never come across it before, they were just really, really pissed off, no question about it. But there you go, they lost that one. And if you look at the 70s, you just see a period of kind of basically, that word again, anarchy, I suppose you could say, with all kinds of riots and sit-downs, a lot of them over layoff pay, because Ford workers didn't get layoff pay. I'm sure Rod can fill in on that one later. And that was a very, very resented injustice. They were sent home because some other plant had stopped work, and they were just sent home, which of course was nice, but they didn't get any money for it. So I think that's quite an interesting issue, really. And these kinds of disputes were, riots and occupations, and a lot of quite melodramatic stuff was going on through the 70s. Very often a bit sort of sad in a way. There was a big riot in the body plants, and workers were sort of throwing mugs at the management block windows and all kinds of things. And then the official who I spoke to about it said, when they were all sort of, they'd kind of worn themselves out, and they all gathered in a room, and they were just sort of lying there exhausted on these chairs and just feeling completely sort of demoralised and, feeling there was nothing they could do. And of course the, leading activists got sacked over that. So that was the sort of stuff that was going on in the 70s, and interestingly also, of course, this was the time of the wage control, what do they call it? I can't remember, wage restraint, whatever, of the Labour government in 1974 to 5. And there were two things going on from the Labour government. One was that they brought in all this very allegedly pro-union legislation, Employment Protection Act, the Trade Union Labour Relations Act, and of course the Health and Safety at Work Act. What I'm interested in that, and I'm trying to do some research on this, is whether the TUC or anyone involved in the negotiations around TULRA ever proposed the right to have meetings in work's time, because that would have been a really good thing to have, but that they didn't get that. I'm trying to do a bit of research at the moment to find out if that was discussed at all, or if anybody here knows whether that was discussed at all. But they had all kinds of other rights which sounded very good, but which actually could be argued, I think Richard Hyman might have argued, actually led to an increased bureaucratisation of shop stewards. And I'm going to, that we can come back to that in the discussion. I would say, just to anticipate, that I don't think there was bureaucratisation as early as that. I think it really didn't start coming in until the employers got interested in things like employee involvement and, those kinds of joint type techniques. Okay, so we come to the end of the 70s, and of course Fords again in the headlines. They weren't the first to strike in the Winter of Discontent, but they were the most, I suppose, prominent. It was actually the bakers who went on strike before them, and then Fords went out just after that in November 78 to 79. it was just the end of 78. And they really, people said they'd driven a coach and horses through incomes policy. They were totally fed up with this incomes policy. It was incredibly unjust. Inflation was in double figures during this period, and they were supposed to, make do with a 5% wage increase. Have I already said that they defeated Jack Jones over it in 1977? I think I've just said that. Well, they did anyway. And the resolution to do that came from 1107. Okay, so we're into the early 80s, and Thatcherism on the horizon. And Steve Hart, who was, I don't know if anybody's come across Steve Hart, quite an interesting name to raise in this context, T&G official for Dagenham at the time. And he made quite an interesting comment when I interviewed him. He said the active minority were worried about Thatcher winning, but most workers just, were fed up with what Labour had been doing to them. They weren't sorry, if you like, that Labour had lost. So this active minority, that's a bit of a obsession of mine, these activists. But they are in a minority, and I think that's something I'd like to get back to in the discussion as well. So you didn't really see an immediate impact of Thatcherism, but it did begin to, not so much Thatcherism per se, but, as I say, really more important to workplace relations at Dagenham and conditions at Dagenham were the techniques, the management techniques that were originated in Japan. And in fact, Ford's project was called After Japan, and the Japanese nature of them, just to anticipate, led to a rather unfortunate banner in the 1988 strike at Fords, which said, "We're Brits, not Nips." And I did ask the 1107ers about that, and they said it certainly wasn't anything to do with them. Again, perhaps Rod could comment on that. But from the early 80s onwards, all the deals, they were these 2-year deals. And so the first one, I think, was at about 83, and it was 85 to 86, and it was 87 to 88. And each one of those deals brought in more aspects of employee involvement of various kinds. And by I'm not sure what time, by the late-ish 80s anyway, management at Dagenham was doing all these things that were becoming common in workplaces all over the place, taking the stewards out of the factory, taking them to some nice hotel. In the case of the sort of event that Jim Brinklow, one of the 1107ers, told me about, that was apparently in the same hotel that Thatcher nearly got blown up in later on, but who knows. Anyway, so they take them to a nice hotel, they ply them with drink all night, which of course is great, and then the next day they try to involve the stewards in these kind of little, sort of joint exercises. And Jim Brinklow, who was the chair of the branch that I write the history of, very, very good, very principled guy, he said that, there'd been a bit of a disagreement amongst the 1107ers. I'm going to come back to what happened with 1107, which I'm not really talking about yet, in which the convener, then a black guy called Joe Gordon, was kind of up for considering some of these things. And the 1107 leadership didn't want that at all. They said, no, we're not going to do this joint stuff with Fords. And so, as I say, Jim Brinklow was very much against this, and he went round all these little rooms in the hotel seeing what people were doing. And he came upon one room where one of the stewards was sort of sitting there cutting out pictures, these silly little exercises they do. And he just bore down on him in a rage and said, "You carry on doing that and I'll see you lose your, you're back on the floor," or whatever. And he said the guy was really terrified and stopped cutting out pictures or whatever. So they took a very, very militant attitude towards that. Jim Brinklow and the convener, eventually the convener of the PTA, Steve Riley. You may have heard of Steve Riley, a very well-known figure who unfortunately has now disappeared. And he too was totally against it. But of course it's very difficult to stop those things coming in. The officials would let them in. It was all to do with these strings. Every deal in the 80s had strings, and the workers said, I can't remember what the demand was, something or other, no strings. But nevertheless the officials would agree them. And I think it was the third negotiations in the 80s, the 1988 one, when there was a strike. I was going to say now. Yeah, they brought in, oh that's right, they decided to do the negotiations plant by plant, which for some reason was supposed to be better for the workplace trade union, but in fact, of course, divided the plants up. And all the time they were bringing in these strings, and the active minority, the 1107ers, were against that. Well, it's about time I said something about 1107, since that's the history I've written. I've already said that the branch itself was formed in 1946, and for the next, almost 4 decades, it sort of trundled along in not a particularly noteworthy way. In fact, the convener I mentioned, Bernie Passingham of the river plant, said he thought 1107 was a bit soft. And it was sort of based, well, it wasn't based in the engine plants, but it was the secretary of it, I think he was either the secretary or the chair, was a guy called Johnny Davis, who was the deputy convener in the engine plant. And he was definitely somebody who didn't like to see conflict between, workers and management. He said, workers don't want to lose pay, we keep them at work, blah, blah, blah. He was very conciliatory. And the general leadership of the 1107 before the early 80s was not only quite, quite moderate, if you like, but also actually, I shouldn't say this, inverted commas, corrupt. They accumulated a lot of money, particularly because then, before Chekhov it would all be cash, or even after Chekhov it was all cash, I don't know. No, before. Anyway, so there's a lot of cash floating around, and apparently, allegedly, they were using this in not very nice ways, not good ways. And it wasn't really just because of the corruption at all. I think it's because they basically, the 1107 leadership was not acting in the interests of the workforce. So some of the stewards in the PTA, almost all of them in the PTA, although there were engine plant workers involved as well, staged a sort of coup in sometime in the 1980s, I can't remember the exact date, early 80s, and they just outnumbered the previous leadership at a branch meeting, and got their positions for themselves. So the chair was Jim Brinklow, as I've said. Rod got some position, I don't remember, I'm sure he does. The branch secretary, Ron Dowell, I don't know, all the names that are all mentioned in this book, and that are very much the people I knew when I did the research, were the 1107ers, the ones that sort of took over the branch, and they made it into a very sort of political branch. There's a wonderful quote from one of those activists, Alan Dana Jones, which unfortunately they only did a little bit of from the back. He says, "It was one of the best branches going. 1107 spread their wings a bit, helped other trade union members. The banner of the 1107 was always there on marches and rallies all over Britain, supporting other workers like the nurses, miners and bus drivers, blah, blah, blah." So, there we talk about, the politics of trade unionism, or trade unionism socialism. You have a direct connection there. And I can say a bit more later, perhaps in questions about, whether the revolution, what kind of influence or role was played by the revolutionary left. Not that much as such. Okay, so the leadership of the new 1107 was a very, very different ballgame, and in fact, the branch, although there was, as I say, many very good activists involved who came from the engine plant, including Rod, the prime leadership, if you like, was based in the PTA, and they were all shop stewards. So it was as if there was a complete sort of identification between the branch and the workplace organisation. It was a workplace branch, but that didn't mean that unfortunately they couldn't have meetings in works time, as I mentioned already, and they did meet off the premises, and a few hours after or an hour or so after the shift had ended, so you had to be pretty dedicated to go to the branch meeting. So in the usual way of these things, it was a minority of activists who were consistently in there doing what they could to change things, and also, of course, support the rest of the trade union movement. So they were doing a very good job. But as I've said, the 80s were really a period, particularly towards the end of the decade, when there was just more and more, of this collusion, or this attempt by management to bring in, to foster collusion between, perhaps the lower levels of management and the workforce. And they would bring in things like what they called lead operators, who were group leaders in other areas, who were sort of supposed to be like our team leaders, you might have called them in other contexts. And one person I spoke to said, I think it was Alan Martin from the engine plant, he said, but they did this very, very carefully, very cleverly, because they would appoint some sort of older person that everybody respected, and people say, he's a good guy, we'll sort of go along with him. And then, of course, before long, it was just, the usual thing of trying to divide the workforce. But the 1107ers and the stewards in the PTA plant really held out against things like team working. They said, this is going to mean that if somebody's, absent for a long time because they've got illness in the family or something like that, the rest of the people in the team will say, we can do without them, or that the pressure is on to say, get rid of that person. And that went completely against all their sort of principles of solidarity and so forth. Well, as we go through the 90s, although 1107 was still very, strong and so on, the shop steward organisation, particularly in the PTA, remained very strong. I should say at this point that in the engine plant there was increasingly a division, which I've already mentioned really, between the engine plant and the PTA. And one of the issues in the engine plant, which was bitterly complained to me about by a couple of 1107 activists, was that the T&G shop stewards, the assembly line shop stewards there, had enormous constituencies of 200, whereas the craft stewards only had sort of 10 or something. So one steward, Ted Amos, said to me, I couldn't get out of my car in the morning without being besieged by members with grievances because he had such a huge constituency, whereas in the PTA, stewards had about 60. So, this was another aspect of trade unionism in the engine plant which really seemed to go against basic workplace trade union democracy. And as you go into the 90s, you do see the beginnings of even the most militant activists like Steve Riley, who really was a major figure at the PTA, sort of apologising. Like there was a big unofficial strike in 1995. In fact, there were unofficial strikes all the time in the PTA, but there was a particularly big one in 1995. And the Financial Times report has Steve Riley saying, this really wasn't such a good idea, they should have gone through the union, blah, blah, blah. And then the next thing that happened, which really was a disgrace, was this issue of the whiting out of faces on a Ford poster. Basically, they'd asked Ford, whatever the publicity people they used, Ford decided they wanted a poster featuring workers from Dagenham, so the workers were quite pleased to be in that, nice, and so they took photos of them, all very nice. But the next thing they heard was that certainly, there's some adverts sent abroad, definitely Poland and possibly Spain, their faces had been whited out. In fact, they've been, in some cases, being given completely different faces. White faces, not black faces. And people were absolutely furious, and of course they wanted to walk out. And the steward, in fact, Steve Riley asked a steward who himself was of colour to sort of try and keep things down, a guy called Roger Dillon. And Roger said, he said, okay, better stay put, don't walk out. And he said afterwards he really regretted that, and he should have just let them go, because it was such an atrocious episode. But you do begin to see, I suppose with the trade union laws, or the anti-trade union laws, the beginnings of this kind of, level of bureaucratisation, just to refer to the Richard Hyman thesis. I think it happened a lot later at Fords than Richard Hyman was talking about. Again, I think we can get Rod's opinion on that. And in the late 90s, was it? Probably late-ish 90s, there was a terrible episode in the Ford engine plant, which again showed how far apart the two plants had grown. Something I haven't mentioned, which I should have mentioned a long time ago, was that 1107 was absolutely, great about racist issues. They defended workers of colour all the way along the line. They played a big role in trying to get into get Asian workers to be able to drive trucks. The truck fleet was completely monopolised by white workers, father to son and all the rest of it. They didn't succeed. 1107 did not succeed in allowing workers of colour. The truck fleet workers left the T&G in protest, their protest, and joined the United Road Transport Union. which for all I know they're still in. But they did certainly have a good go at that. And so they were always fighting issues of racism. Of course, there were many, many black and Asian workers at Fords, many, many. And the engine plant, on the other hand, clearly were not taking that stance as much. And this all exploded in the late 90s with a terrible episode involving an Asian worker called Sushi Parma, who was treated in the most appalling way for, bullied basically for weeks and months, and Rod Wood does know all about that because either he was his steward or he definitely stuck his neck out in defence of Sujit. And there was another Asian worker who received rather similar treatment, and this kind of really blew up. The engine plant leadership refused to really defend this worker, but some of them were actually in the National Front or BNP by that time. They really were very right-wing. So there was a kind of big, episode, shall we say. And the then Chief Executive Officer of Fords globally, a guy called Jack Nasser, who was, I think, Armenian, and sort of not a relevant point, but I suppose it gave him a bit more of a thing about issues of race. He had recently received an Equalities Award in America, and he was absolutely furious about this episode, which of course got a lot of publicity, and he said, if this carries on, I'm going to close Dagenham down, but in fact Dagenham PTA was closed down. But so that was an episode of the late 90s which was really terrible and did demonstrate the huge split by that time between the engine plant and the PTA. And that leads me to almost the sad end of my story, which was the closure of the PTA, which was sort of, announced, if you like, in the year 2000 and came to pass in the year 2002. So the whole PTA was closed down. It just, not there anymore. And obviously, one of the reasons, of course, there was a big protest, huge, people, no, you can't do this and all the rest of it. And there's a very interesting document sent around by a sort of radical activist from Liverpool, who some of you might have heard of, called Greg Dropkin. And he made a distinction between those who were organising to win, those who were organising not to win, those who were organising to fail or something, and those who were organising to win. And the people who were organising to win, to try and fight this closure, of course, were the active minority yet again, and they really wanted to stand out against the closure. But the opposition was terrible. It was all split. There was no concerted fight for a site-wide strike over the closure, and in the end it was just left to the PTA, and the company gave enormous redundancy payments, which were, can you imagine if you're, say, a West Indian worker who's worked in this horrible place for 20 years and you're being offered sort of, 30,000 quid or more, and you can go and retire to the West Indies, that's going to seem like a very nice deal. But it wasn't so good for younger workers who, of course, couldn't get other jobs, so on and so forth. So we've passed to the very recent history, during which the engine plant and this thing that was built in sometime in the early 2000s called the Dagenham Diesel Centre were the only factories on the site. They were no longer producing cars, just engines, diesel engines. And the leadership, the workplace leadership, also switched to a group of shop stewards who just didn't seem to be very concerned with what was happening on the shop floor. I heard about this a lot from my 1107 contacts who were still there. There was a very poignant phrase used by an African American woman who I interviewed right at the end of my research about life at the engine plant, and the phrase she used about the shop stewards is they don't come down. They don't come down to the floor. They don't come and see what's going on. You can't get a steward. One of the 1107ers, Terry Turner, made a point about it. You cannot get someone to come and help you. And he himself was barred from becoming a shop steward by some sort of management action, which of course was absolutely scandalous. And so we come to the sad end of 1107, which occurred when Unite, of course the murder had taken place by that time, and Unite decided that, we really didn't need how many union branches there were at Dagenham. Only one was needed, right? And so an election was held right at the end, I can't remember when it was, 2012. And to that election came only workers who had been given paid time off. The same woman who I interviewed at the end said that they weren't given paid time off. So it seems to be very much, we don't get too paranoid here, but it seems very much to be in a collaboration between this more reactionary union leadership and the management to, give some workers paid time off and others not. So presumably they were going to, perhaps Rod would be able to fill in the details. And unfortunately 1107 lost that election in September 2012, and the branch gained a rather peculiar name with just lots of letters and numbers, which I don't remember. And so really, RIP 1107, and the end of a wonderful, wonderful tradition of active workplace trade unionism, which of course led to very political trade unionism on their part, although in the discussion perhaps we can talk about whether workers on the shop floor actually took place and, got into that kind of aspect. And I think I've probably just run out of steam, so I'll finish there.
Okay, thanks very much, Sheila. There's more in the book, but we've got some time now for questions and discussion, so yes.
Apologies that I'm going to have to think of something else, so I thought I'd get
thank you.
my questions in first. Basically, two questions.
Yeah.
I've only skimmed through the book, but you give a lot of attention in that to the post-coup in the 80s through the 90s as a time
Oh yes, of course, yes.
Unashamedly militant.
Yes.
I wondered what explanations you had for that. Obviously you mentioned PTA, working conditions being different, organising a particular branch meeting. But when the other factors, and it does seem odd, and it's against a national trend. Obviously, the downturn and class struggle that occurred in the 80s.
Oh, right, yeah.
Generally across the country, and in Fords. So in Halewood, I believe there was a ballot over another national strike like the 78 ones in 81, and that was lost against the union recommendation. So it's a general downturn, following the closure of British Lane and Speak No. 2 plant.
Yeah, of course, yes.
So it seems kind of odd that this was the time when this branch was particularly militant and went against that trend. And the second question is, something I'm curious about is the nature of the kind of shop stewards that were part of that kind of militant phase. And the Hugh Bainham book presents a very vivid portrait of what that group of shop stewards and how it would like in '79, and kind of young, and their lifestyle and kind of political views. And I'd just like a bit more about that kind of group of stewards. And one thing you did raise was the role of the revolutionary left. So I'm particularly curious about how many of those people acting in the branch at the time were either current or ex-members of revolutionary groups like IMG, Socialist League, SWB, etc.
Right. Okay. Shall I
come back. Yeah.
Shall I go back to that now?
Yeah.
Wow, you've asked me quite a difficult question, to be perfectly honest. Yes, I should have thought about that. Why on earth did this happen now? Again, I'd like perhaps Rod to come in at some point. The stewards were mostly young, and they didn't have sort of particularly revolutionary political views. Rod was an exception, but Steve Riley was very much on the left. I don't think he was ever a member of any organisation. In fact, as far as I know, none of these, they were all stewards, as I say, they were mostly active stewards in the PTA, and some in the engine plant. Youngish, I suppose. Certainly none of them, as far as I know, were actually in revolutionary organisations. IS, I remember, had 12 members at one time, I think before it became the SWP. I also remember that in 1968, so this of course was miles before you're talking about, shop stewards went to the All Trade Union Alliance gathering, the British Leyland, which was the SLL, and then went pear-shaped after that. But it's actually a very interesting question. The only real response I've got, which isn't really a response to your question, is what actually motivated workers to become shop stewards. And the interesting thing there is they all say something like, what Ron Dowell said was something like, I was a young bloke, used to speak up for myself a bit, and so the others pushed him forward to speak up for them. And that was something I've been reading again recently. It's basically about a worker to be just like their fellow workers, not sort of some kind of intellectual or political activist, but just being someone who speaks up a bit, and that's what pushes the members into pushing them. So I don't really think that they were so much, sort of revolutionary people, possibly less than had been the case at Halewood, but they certainly were just, really very committed political activists. I think a lot of them, probably at the time, and again I think I have to ask Rod to fill in here, they would have been on the left of the Labour Party, many of them, but there actually isn't, I don't know, that's curiously enough, that's something I didn't really investigate, but from what there was one steward who definitely was political with a big P, and that was Mick Gosling, who got sacked in 1988. I don't know how many people here have heard of Mick Gosling, but he really was. I mean, he'd been in the IMG and so forth. I'm not sure if he still was when he was working at Fords. But it's an interesting thing about Mick's sacking was that for some reason, I should have investigated that more when I was writing the book, there wasn't a strike in his defence, and I don't know why. I think it may possibly have been because people did perhaps think, well, he's this politico who's come in here and is trying to, I don't know. Rod, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think the answer to the colleague's question here, when Tony Benn was in the Labour government, he was one of the ones that negotiated with Ford about the sale of Riggs Body Plant to Ford. And he said...
That happened long before Ben was in...
Was that before?
Yeah, long before.
Well, he was in negotiation with Ford. And he said that dealing with Ford was like dealing with the government of quite a powerful foreign country. So when Sheila said about 1988 strike, a lot of the union officials warned the shop stewards that there could well be sackings because look what had happened to all the other trade unions. But Ford's is a multinational that doesn't obey any government. So and that goes back to 78 as well. The breaking of the pay freeze stuff is because Ford's was Ford management would make decisions on their own business basis. In 88, the 1 week strike had already stopped the whole of Europe because of the just-in-time stuff. In 78, the 10-week strike, Ford said to the government in the end, "Don't you're losing too much money." And then when you took what was happening in Fords, now one thing that I thought was interesting from Sheila's book, when you were talking to Kevin Halpin, he was talking about the need to coordinate the different car firms, the workers of the different car firms in Britain. Unfortunately, we never thought of that. But what we did have was international contact. In 1985, we had the first, and only unfortunately, the first Ford Workers' World Conference. We had delegates from Brazil. Riley had been out to Brazil. We had delegates from Japan, from Malaysia, from South Africa, from Mexico, from the United States, from Canada. Now, most of them were shop steward level, convener level. A number of them were led by trade union officials, like the Portuguese, because the Portuguese Communist Party had a big grip on it. Sorry to interrupt you, Rod, it's just that I wanted to try and answer the actual question a bit more closely, if I could. I mean, obviously, you've got massive knowledge coming later about those other issues. But I think what I wanted to say, actually, which is quite an interesting question, because though they weren't revolutionaries, they were political activists, and their political activism came out of their shop floor experience. So I think that's an interesting question. They weren't sort of people who, apart from Mick Gosling, who possibly did have that motive, they weren't people who sort of really wanted to foment revolution from the shop floor. They just wanted to get a good deal for the workers. So that's, sorry to interrupt you, but what I was trying to say to the colleague here, not speak too much, you see, but was that Fords wasn't typical of what was happening to the British working class. The miners were getting battered, everyone was getting battered, the docks were being cleared out in Tilbury and all that sort of stuff. the print workers and all that. But that never happened to us. The police never launched attacks on us on the picket lines, which we were expecting. But that's to do with Fords, because Fords is saying to the government, we're losing too much money, the whole of Europe stopped. We're not having it, pay them. No, not that they gave us a great rise, but they gave us
They did at one time, didn't they? 17% rise because of that, in the wake of the incomes policy. They did do that.
Why I said 85, because that was at the highlight of the unofficial movement working with the official movement. We had Mick Murphy as the chairman, who was the motor industry guy from the TNG and the main negotiator in the National Negotiating Committee. So we had unofficial and official joined together. The engineering union leadership outlawed it. The American union outlawed it. It's a bunch of commies in Britain.
Oh yeah. There was Communist Party influence.
From all, and actually, I'd have loved to have been a bunch of communists from Britain, but it wasn't.
Yeah, actually, to just sort of supplement that, I wasn't really thinking about the Communist Party influence. Of course, that came a lot earlier than the 1107 thing. So there was Communist Party influence, but Paquet Rod, it was often in a rather conciliatory direction, which is
on
listed.
the World Conference thing, Lula, who became president of Brazil,
he was there.
one of the delegates from Brazil, and there was a huge argument between the Americans and the Brazilians, because the Americans were losing work to Brazil, and it took quite a discussion to get that worked out, and all the different problems in each country. You couldn't have the same wages, but what you could do, what was on the table, was we'll have one common day for pay negotiations from Japan to South Africa to Brazil, and that way they couldn't play up one group against another, because what they used to do, if there was a strike somewhere, they'd increase production somewhere else, And by the way, one of the inspirations was a guy called Alan Haley, Big Flame. He was one of the inspirations for the unofficial movement.
He's my,
Sorry?
he's kind of my father-in-law.
Oh, really?
He's your father-in-law?
Wish I'd known that. I was trying to get hold of him.
Small world. So.
Yeah, very interested in what you're saying, because I started selling Socialist Worker there in 1967/1968.
Sorry, could I have a name?
Terry Ward. Stabby Segal used to go down in the day with his students. I used to go on Friday night. We put out a bulletin, usually about 1,000, 1,500 copies. We do know that it was very closely monitored by everybody in there, because on one occasion, I think it was in '68, the Fords had nationally an advertising campaign linking in with football, and they launched what they called the Fords Sporting League. And if your team had good conduct record on the pitch, you got bonus points. In other words, you lost points if you had people sent off or booked. And as you rightly say, one of the key issues was parity, because in Coventry, the workers were much better paid than at Dagenham, and the Dagenham stewards all the time were talking about we want parity. So I hit upon one day was subsequently turned out to be a smart idea of saying that Ford workers want wage parity rather than football charity.
Oh, good one.
And we put this out on a bulletin, and fairly shortly afterwards, this Ford advertising campaign ceased. Ford Sporting League, they weren't interested. In a short space of time, a small band of revolutionists in the International Socialists recruited a couple of stewards and one guy called Jim Lamborn, who used to write regularly in Socialist Worker. The Communist Party, to our surprise, were not actually critical of us. We were had so much standing in their eyes and some of the workers that they even invited Sammy Segal and myself along to the Communist Party meetings at Fords. And on one of the occasions they had Bert Randallson there, who was their chief hatching industrial organiser. And I can remember in 1968, Sammy was invited by the Ford shop stewards to speak to for 5 or 10 minutes on events in France. And I, as the sort of secretary of Dagenham ISN, my name address used to be on the leaflet, and had a phone call from, I can't remember, you obviously know the place, but there was a place outside Paris where they kind of surrounded it and the workers took over. And I had a phone call from the guy saying, would I tell him what was happening in the Ford strike in Dagenham? In those days, if you had a foreign phone call, it had to go through various operators, which was quite surprising. And I remember, after that time, Sally Segal invited a couple of shop stewards to dinner. We met Tony Cliff. And then Sally started ferrying conveners like Henry Friedman up to the London School of Economics. Henry Friedman later wrote a book. And I know Sally was very active in assisting Rose, who was the kind of leader of the, I think she was the main spokesman for the
Rose.
women.
I don't know a Rose. Lil O'Callaghan. Rosie Boland, of course. Anyway, Rosie Boland. Yeah.
He used to kind of ferry them around to various things to get publicity and solidarity. So, when we started, just a handful of us, and because we were pretty well organised, I think we managed to make a significant impact. Nobody did the television play about us, but I think Fords were listening.
Well, I wish Sabby had put me onto you. I would have found out so much more, I'll kill him. Not kill him, but I'm a bit annoyed with him.
Okay. I used to work with Jim
He's an excellent guy. Really nice guy. Yeah, he used to write me. Did you read Bob Bateman those days? Jimmy Lamborn used to write on the back.
What?
Socialist working.
I'm not sure I didn't.
Yeah, right. Sorry, but one other point I just quickly mention is, I have to disagree, I used to take groups of kids around there in the 1970s when I was a teacher, and the PTA was bad, but the foundry was worse.
Oh, the foundry, of course.
And also in the foundry, my kind of empirical observation would be that the workers were either Irish or West Indian. And that idea of separating ethnic groups was classic Ford American policy.
Yes. No, you're right about the foundry being mainly Irish. I don't know if I really want to necessarily come back on that if other people have got... I just wasn't aware of the tradition that you've spoken about, which I really could have done with being aware of.
That wasn't the Socialist Historians Newsletters passing a discussion between Ian Bertram and Mr. Ramilson's biographers about whether or not he was indeed a fine or rather less than fine fellow.
The role of... Bert Ramilson.
Yeah, there was a lengthy exchange where we attempted to suggest to the biographers, or we did, Bert Ramilson perhaps wasn't quite such a marvellous figure as they believed him to be.
There's some quite interesting stuff about the role of the CP from the 30s anyway that I recorded. It was one of the was a magazine called Ford Worker or something that came out for a while.
That's all on the website if anybody wants to check back on that. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Michael Weatherburn. I'm writing about industrial relations up to 1948, so it's absolutely fascinating for me to hear you start at 1948 and move on. So I cover the CB, the AU, the CNG, all these, it's absolutely fascinating. The thing I haven't done is I'm right at the end of my studies, I picked up a lot about industrial management, so I can answer some of the questions you asked about. So why weren't Fords doing piecework and everyone else was?
Well, I sort of knew about that.
One of Ford's biggest things was to cut unit costs, and the good thing about piecework and variable bonuses is it's expensive because you need to monitor all the workers and all this, and it creates lots of paperwork. And then one of the whole things about Fords is basically no paperwork. It was very streamlined, so that's one of the reasons why I didn't have that. It worked in the earlier period, but not by the time you're talking about. The other one, on the gradings, I read your article on this, the 1968 strike. I accidentally picked up in a memoir of a management consultant why it took so long to set up the gradings of the strikers. Do you know this?
Well, carry on.
I was under the impression that Fords were trying to get management consultants in to settle the gradings because they knew there were loads of problems.
They started off with, it was all done by management consultants. I can't remember which they were, very well known.
Or ended up doing
that's right.
British. The trouble is they were bidding against McKinsey, who were American, who were much bigger, and so basically there was a kind of weird management consultancy industrial struggle. Fords couldn't work out whether they get the British guys in or the American guys, and that's why it took so long.
Well, it might have been that, but at the same time, sewing machines seemed to be at the very end of the line. That was one of the reasons, that's one thing I got a bit fed up about. So it's interesting to get the background.
Reading the memoir of the guy who was actually the consultant doing it was really interesting.
Yes, it would be.
He was really frustrated by it, although much richer than the workers.
That might have helped, yes.
But that's all really interesting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
The reason I came, Sheila,
Yes.
Chairman, you wind me up about talking to you.
No, it was me. It was me. That was.
Chairman.
There I go.
Go on.
I don't want to upset you, Sheila, but I, for one, and there are others, not at all happy with your book.
Well, they could have said something about that before, because I sent drafts. Anyway, Karen, yeah. Can you just tell me why not? Sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
all I have to say is
Yes.
that I had bits and pieces, but I never, ever had the full draft. I spent the Christmas reading the book, and there's a whole number of things that bother me about it. The conclusion, the impression it gives is wrong. There's a load of small mistakes in it. It worries me about research. If I could just say this, that there was a bloke who wrote a book on Mao, and he said that Mao never brushed his teeth and all stuff like that in the book, and that the Chinese Communist Party never fought the Japanese. If you read Max Hastings, who I think he's a conservative, Max Hastings,
he certainly is.
but he's a very good, he doesn't put rubbish out, in my opinion. He knocked all that stuff based on his observation of the facts. Now, what bothers me with research is I'm not a book writer, I'm not an academic, but the research has to be as truthful and as accurate as possible. And when it's mistaken, for example, the end of your book, Sheila, you get the impression that the branch is anti-merger. We were one of the leading branches for merger. We knew perfectly well
Didn't think I'd said
that
it.
it may mean our elimination, but when you took the argument throughout the whole of Britain for the engineering union and the T&G to merge, Roger Dillon was on the merger committee, I was on the merger committee, but the impression you get from your book is that we were like Jerry Hicks fans or something, which was absolutely the opposite. We supported Len McCluskey. That's just, then you missed the whole Irish bit. The story with Mick Gosling you got wrong. The issue of Vistian is wrong.
Could you just say what I got wrong about Mick Gosling?
Mick Gosling, we had, what's the very brave Irish lady that got shot?
Bernadette Devlin. Bernadette Devlin, Michaeliski, yeah.
She came down the Fords barking several times in the 60s.
Right. So that's what Mick got, that was one of the triggers for his dismissal. She was in Fred's Caff, because originally we had the mill house in Dagenham, but the police come down heavy on the mill house with the anti-terrorism stuff. And she came in the 60s to a huge crowd, late 60s, but she came also over when was this?
She came to the swing bars, and she also came to Barking Town Hall on one occasion.
Right, and then later on, she came back. Lovely person. She said, we'll have a meeting in the street if they ban us from all the buildings. Great. And that's after she'd actually been shot,
How long have we got?
Got a few minutes, so
it's the company that said that he'd gone to Ireland, and of course he would have told you that there was a ballot over saving him, and the ballot was lost, and that was part of the anti-political stuff, anti-Irish thing, all that sort of thing. And Mick and me went over as branch delegates to the Vistian in Belfast, and Belfast carried the Vistian struggle, because what happened in the Basildon occupation only lasted a day. Des Helmskirk's part of that. You spoke to Des. The riot squad turned up, and said, if you come out now, you won't be prosecuted. If you don't come out now, we're going to come in, drag you out, and you'll be all prosecuted. So that closed down, that was the collapse of the Basildon occupation, Basildon Vestian, Ford Vestian. Enfield lasted 3 days. Riot Squad turned up again and gave them the same offer, out now, or we're coming in for you and you're going to be prosecuted.
And it lasted at least a week.
They wouldn't, well, whatever, that was how it ended. They wouldn't attack Belfast because the unique thing about Belfast was you had a merger, you know, the working together of UVF and IRA people in the Belfast plant, together with the unions.
I'm sorry, Rod.
That doesn't come out.
I didn't talk about Belfast.
To Ireland,
all right, but okay. So perhaps I didn't mention that. That doesn't mean I was inaccurate. I quoted somebody who was in the Enfield occupation because he wrote an article.
Do you want to come back briefly on some of the?
Yes, I would like to, please. In the first place, I never got any comments back. I did. You say you never had a full draft. I sent drafts of the chapters to Ron Dowell, who I obviously expected to circulate them. I was at a small meeting with you and others, where Ron said there's some inaccuracies. So I said, well, please, will you tell me what those inaccuracies were? That was long before I finished the book, or certainly a good few months before I finished the book. Ron never came back to me on what he said these inaccuracies were. So I've also had a call from Pete Singh, who was a bit unhappy, I think, because I recorded this whole, rather funny episode about them, getting out of an episode where they're accused of drinking at work. But the problem I've had is that nobody from the branch got back to me while I was writing the book. And so any inaccuracies, if you like, obviously are my responsibility, but at the same time, if people had read the drafts and were worried about it, concerned about it, I was only too happy to hear back from them, but I didn't hear from any of them, apart from you, when you rang on Christmas Day and said something about that you'd done a bit more over Sushi Parma than I'd recorded in the book. That's all you said, and in fact I incorporated that comment. I said that you'd actually helped to defend him in his neighbourhood. So as far as I'm aware, that's the only concrete inaccuracy that there was. Nobody told me about these other inaccuracies that you mentioned. The thing about Mick Gosley and Concord was that, according to the local press, Bernadette McAliskey was not at Dagenham at that time. So that was, certainly Mick Gosling never, I said, the only person who did comment on the drafts was Mick Gosling, right? And I did correct some of the inaccuracies that he pointed out. And he certainly didn't say anything there was anything wrong with that.
Well, we've got the story all wrong now.
I've got the story all wrong?
Yeah.
Well, I do beg your pardon, but might have been nice to have heard a bit more about it in the first place. Okay. I wonder if we could get any other questions from anyone else.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, but that's...
I know I'm not chairing the meeting.
One of the reasons for... Yeah, absolutely. We'll do that. One of the reasons for these kind of discussions is to have these kind of exchanges. So, that you can...
Again, sorry, what you said about there being... when you say anti-merger, I'm not sure if you're talking about the bringing together of all the branches at Dagenham into one. No, I don't think I said anything about being anti-merger. Certainly Terry Turner expressed some, unhappiness with how Unite was behaving after the merger between Amicus and the TNG, because that gave a lot more influence to the originally AEU stewards. And, he made a lot of...
Well, that's Fords.
I'm talking about Fords.
Sorry?
I'm talking about Fords. The book is about Fords.
But the argument in the branch, Sheila, was over what's good for the working people in this country.
I'm sure it was.
Or division.
Are you talking about the merger between TNG and the AEU?
Yes.
You didn't make that very clear.
You see, there's a whole problem in the trade union movement. That branches, you've got a bit of corruption in some branches.
Yeah. Could I cut across you, please, Rob? Because I want to get to the point here. I would like to get to the point here, which is that the expressions of discontent with Unite were mainly in the quoted by Terry Turner. He was somebody I interviewed a few times, and he was not happy with how the shop stewards were acting after the merger between the engineering union and the TNG, which produced Unite. He was talking about the nature nature of shop steward organisation in that context. He also wasn't happy with Unite itself. He said that, you know, there were lots of disputes. He would try to get a district official and nobody would come. So, you know, read what he said. He said these things. He himself has never protested about me, has said that it was inaccurate.
It doesn't represent the 1107 branch.
I was simply quoting what 1107 members said.
What 1107?
Yes, what 1107 members said, and it's quoted in his words. I didn't say that this is the policy of 1107 as decided. So, okay, I think that's probably enough.
So, thank you. Anything else you want to pitch in?
Can I ask another?
Yeah, of course.
Because you were talking about this, maybe relevant more to the earlier period, but we were talking about transfer of American Ford policies to British Ford.
Yeah.
And of course, we know that American Ford were using all kinds of private strike breakers. Their sociological department.
Yes.
It's a sinister organisation.
Yeah, right.
And I've been doing some research on the Economic League in this country, and I was just wondering if there were private sort of labour spies and infiltration and things like that in Fords here.
Well, the only thing I actually know about, Rod might be able to add to this, but the only thing I actually know about is that they did have people looking into the background records of people who applied to work at Fords. I'm not sure if they did this only if they were particularly suspicious, but there were two young women who came to work at Fords and had worked at BT, and they looked into their backgrounds and found out they were members of the IMG or something like that, and so they actually got rid of them. They had been working there, and management basically sacked them. They didn't get much support from the workforce there. It's in the book, or was it? I'm not sure if Yeah. So that's really I'm not sure if I actually included it in the book. It's in, you know, obviously I've got a lot of notes that,
There was blacklisting, okay, thanks.
Well, to that extent, yes.
There was very strong blacklisting. There was two Economic League and a local Catholic church in the early days. Because that's the boundary, that's because of the Irish connection. And if you've been involved in industrial action or political activity, you had to go in different from who you actually were, or different date of birth, or whatever, or you'd never get the job there. And finally, the Economic League got outed officially through the FNJNC, through the National Negotiating Committee, by the official union. But that didn't. Then you had internal spies. You know, there's some of the people you speak to aren't what they seem. Just give you an example which has got nothing to do with Fords. The regional chairman of the T&G London Committee, Regional 1 London Committee, was given MI5 information about people he thought was leftist, communist, etc. He worked down at the Tilbury Docks. Now that's an established fact. And you had the same thing within Fords. In the unofficial movement, we had an office worker turned up from Basildon, and nobody was too sure about him until someone went down and spoke to the workers at Basildon. He was a bleeding spy, you know, and these things happen.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they did, yeah.
And it's extremely difficult to deal with it, you know.
Okay. See.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the 68 strike, because you said it wasn't about equal pay, it was about grading. I don't doubt that technically that is absolutely correct. But on the other hand, it was certainly perceived as being about equal pay. Firstly. And secondly, am I not correct that it led to the formation of something called the National Joint Action Committee for Women's Equal Rights, which actually is the beginning of the women's movement in Britain? Everybody tells you the history of the women's movement in Britain. It began with the Oxford Conference in 1969. It didn't. It began with the National Joint Action Committee for Women's Equal Rights, which came out of the Ford sewing machinist strike.
Right. Well, I can only quote to you the words of the sewing machinists themselves, which I'll have to leaf through a bit to get. But they said, in fact, one of them made a really fantastic comment, which I think expressed, the nature of exploitation much better than anybody else, which of course I can't find at this moment. But basically, they said many times that the sewing machinists themselves said it was not about equal pay, it was about upgrading. and I wish I could find this quote. Oh yes, here we are, I think. Yes, well in fact, when Sabi interviewed Rosie Boycott, she said, where is it now? Blast, I can't. Oh yes, Lil O'Callaghan, sorry, a different steward, says, as regards equal pay, some women, even today, it's like 1968, blah, 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 think they shouldn't earn as much or more than their husbands, but they should realise they are working for what they can get, and Fords are making a big profit out of them. They are not working for their husbands, they are working for Fords, and the car is the same price, whether it is men or women doing the job. And what I said was that she defined equal pay not as a high-level political demand or an idealistic call for justice, but simply as what it is, the recognition that workers provide the maximum amount of gender-neutral labour required by the employer's demand for profitability, and that in return they get most they can out of the company to live on. They are working for what they can get. And in fact, the equal pay thing was actually initiated by men in the AEU, particularly Reg Birch. They decided to turn the dispute into one for equal pay because they thought they could get more, sympathy or something like that. So they took that decision, as far as I understand it, unilaterally. And there was another aspect to it as well. Yeah, I mean, Barbara Castle agreed with the idea that it should be an equal pay dispute because she thought that would just mean giving them more money. You see, the upgrading thing was much more controversial because if they'd upgraded these women, then there would have been a huge flood of upgrading demanders from other semi-skilled workers. That's why they didn't do it. They weren't sort of trying to say, women shouldn't get equal pay or something like that. They simply did not want to upgrade this particular group of kind of high-up semi-skilled workers because they'd be getting a deluge of other demands. And it was Reg Birch from the AEU who specifically moved to turn it into a political demand for equal pay. And they were all men on this Shop Stewards Committee, and that was what they did. And, as I say, this very, very insightful shop steward spoke against that in a much, much more political way, really, talk about exploitation.
So, as I understand it, if you were a woman and you were sewing seat covers, which is the only job that actually women did, you had to do a test. That test took an hour, and it based on the quality and the quantity of the seat covers you did in an hour.
Yeah,
now, if you do a test and it takes an hour, that's an indication it's a skilled job.
Yes, that's
whether you call it semi-skilled or man on the moon.
They used that as their evidence, of course.
It was a skilled job.
Yes, that's right.
They argued, regrading, but, no men had to do a test that took an hour.
Right. Yeah,
and they got a semi-skilled
I agree with you. And also, they were very disappointed when they went to the tribunal that they weren't regraded. And there was all this fuss being made about equal pay, and yes, that body that was started, But, basically, the sewing machinists, they never gave up. And I don't know if you know, they had another strike in 84 to 85 to actually get equal pay. regrading. And they got it. They won that time. And then about 3 years later, the seats were outsourced anyway. But, if you read the book, the article that the young man there cited, I think I've made a pretty good case for that, and it makes me angry actually that this dispute is misrepresented away from the actual thoughts, feelings and words of the women who are involved into some kind of lovely political thing, because that is not how they saw it, and it's misrepresented in the film drastically as well. In the film, they make them go from wanted to go from an unskilled grade to a semi-skilled grade, whereas they actually wanted to go from a semi-skilled grade to a skilled grade. There's all kinds of the first third of that film is accurate, and then it just goes off into cloud cuckoo land. Sorry, Ian, but I feel strongly about this. Yeah.
Okay, we've been running for quite a time. If anybody's got any burning points, probably remember that bit quite a little. Yeah, go on.
One other thing, Sheila. It was mentioned to you, and Kevin Halpin should have said something, but really didn't. I don't know he's getting on a bit. But the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions had a considerable role when half the working class was unionised in this country. The Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions, they called the 69 strike against in place of strike. They're the ones that organised the stoppages for the nurses, which was what Ford stopped to support the nurses, and also the campaign for the release of the Pentonville Five.
Right.
No, there never has been. That was one of the most powerful non-official organisations.
Well aware of it.
And it's never been able to be recreated as yet. And I remember telling you that the reason it collapsed was because of the Euro-communists, the infighting within the Communist Party, which discredited, because what they'd managed to do was get conveners and shop stewards committees to send delegates from all sections of industry all over Britain, which was some fantastic achievement.
Well, I totally agree with you on all those points. Are you raising them in relation to the book? Should I have said so? I mentioned the LCD to you in my first book.
That's part of the history of Fords. Fords had delegates going to the liaison committee. That's why there was strikes for the nurses and the various other things I've quoted.
Well,
that wouldn't have happened without the liaison committee for defence and trade unions.
Good point. Right.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Something we haven't touched on that much yet.
I wrote all about it in my first book.
Okay, well, perhaps now's not the time to venture on the liaison committee, but certainly an interesting organisational episode. Perhaps if we can find somebody that's doing current research, we'll get them along to review all them.
Would be interesting.
Anyway, let's conclude the formal session here. Thanks again very much to Sheila and to others who contributed. Very interesting discussion. I think it's the kind of thing we should be doing here. There are some copies of the book if you want to avail yourself if you don't have one. And just a reminder that there's the speaker for that seminar in a couple of weeks. So if you're available, do come along and we may touch a little bit perhaps on Fords in that as well, I don't know. But,
yeah, it's almost a third of the story.
So there we are. Maybe more about Fords next time. Okay, thanks very much.